Hi everyone, and welcome to our next and our final installment of the lecture series for the fall 2013 Old Testament course for the Susquehanna Valley Presbytery Commissioned Lay Preacher Training Program. That's really quite a mouthful. Today we're going to be talking about apocalyptic literature. So we're going to tackle a really interesting but also kind of daunting topic for our last session. Before we jump straight into talking about apocalyptic literature or its features properly, I want to begin today by defining a couple of vocabulary words that, in particular, are two that we really need to keep separate from each other in order to enhance this conversation. So the first word, not surprisingly, that we need to define is apocalyptic. Apocalyptic, or its corresponding noun, apocalyptic is an adjective, of course, its corresponding noun, apocalypse, derives from a Greek word, apokalyptu, which means, it's a verb that means to reveal. So when we see this, in particular, for example, in the final book of the New Testament canon, in Greek, its title is the Apocalypse, or a direct translation of its Greek title is the Apocalypse of John. And in English, of course, we then translate that just a little bit further to say the revelation of John, right? So really that word apocalypse means revelation. And we see this both in etymology and in usage, that it has this sense of an unveiling, of making clear something that is otherwise not clear, or in particular something that is somehow hidden. So when we speak of an apocalyptic text, then, one of the primary features of that text is that it is a text that involves an unveiling or a revelation of some kind. The next word that we need to define and really kind of set over and against the word apocalyptic is the word eschaton, or its adjectival form, eschatological. The eschaton, the noun form, is a noun that means the end or the last things, or we might say the final countdown, or more expansively sometimes the things that are related to the last things and the end times. So eschatological, the adjectival form, then, is the adjective that talks about the things around the end times, or the last things themselves. So thus, if we have an eschatological text, we're talking about a text that in some way describes or broaches the subject of the end times. Now, here's where these two oftentimes get confused, because oftentimes an apocalyptic text, that is a text that deals with a revelation of some sort, is eschatological in the nature of its revelation, which is to say that the revelation is dealing with the things concerning end times. And we see this in, for example, the books of Daniel and in the Revelation of John. But it's also very, very important that we not confuse these terms, despite the way that they're oftentimes confused and muddled in their popular usage. And the reason for this is that not all apocalyptic texts are eschatological. That is, there are apocalyptic texts, there are eschatological texts that are firmly within the tradition of apocalyptic literature, but there are also apocalyptic texts that do not concern anything about the end times whatsoever. We might point, for example, to the text of First Enoch as a good example of apocalyptic literature that is not eschatological. Likewise, it's entirely possible to have other genres of literature that deal with the eschaton, that deal with eschatological things, with the end times, but do so in a way that is not apocalyptic, that is not revelatory. So, for the purposes of our discussion today, be sure to know the difference between apocalyptic, the things having to do with revelation, and eschatological, the things having to do with the end times. So with those definitions in mind, let's now turn our attention to describing apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literature, properly speaking, is a type of literature. So according to the most widely used definition, this is a definition that comes from the Semea 14 volume published in 1979. This has been an enormously influential definition on the field of apocalyptic studies. Apocalyptic literature is the following. This is a quote. Apocalyptic is a genre of revelatory literature within a narrative framework in which a revelation is mediated to an otherworldly being, from an otherworldly being to a human recipient, disclosing a transcendent reality which is both temporal, insofar as it envisages eschatological salvation, and spatial, insofar as it involves another supernatural world. All right, I'm going to do that one more time because this is an enormously dense definition and because I butchered it a little bit. So, apocalyptic literature is a genre of revelatory literature within a narrative framework in which a revelation is mediated by an otherworldly being to a human recipient, disclosing a transcendent reality which is both temporal, insofar as it envisages eschatological salvation, and spatial, insofar as it involves another supernatural world. All right, now, having done that twice, let's try and unpack that a little bit. First, as a genre of literature, apocalyptic is a type of literature that has certain features about it. That is, when something is identified as apocalyptic, as belonging to the apocalyptic genre, there are certain expectations about what one will find there. What those specific features are identified further as the definition continues. Number one, there's a narrative framework. That means that there is a section where a speaker or a third-person narrator describes some sort of action that will ultimately set up the revelation, but that is itself not a part of the revelation. So that's the framework part of it. In the case of Daniel 7, if we take that as an example, we can see this in verse 1, which kind of narrates a setting of Daniel in the Babylonian court of Belshazzar. After the narrative framework, after that narrative beginning, what follows then is a vision, a highly symbolic and oftentimes confusing revelation that continues from verses 2 to verses 14. There, at verse 14, a very confused Daniel, who pops up again as a character, not just as one narrating a vision, turns to one of these attendants, one of these heavenly beings, and that heavenly being, that attendant, is able to interpret the vision for him. Now, the definition that we've just described, what we see in Daniel 7 really fits this definition in terms of having the narrative framework, then the vision, and then the interpretation that's mediated by this otherworldly being. But that definition also includes a couple of different categories, namely the temporal and spatial categories, or we might even call them realms. And we can also see those at work in Daniel 7. Temporally, the various visions of Daniel, but in particular Daniel 7, discuss the empires that dominated the region, that were coming and going over quite a long period of time. And we see this made explicit beginning in verse 17, when the attendant begins to, in the attendant's interpretation of the vision. These kings are identified with the rulers of with the Babylonian, the Median, the Persian, the Greek empires. All of those are at work here. As such, this vision is concerned with all of those empires, all of the empires that ultimately in the vision are defeated by the one who is like a human being, who brings a salvation from these terrible empires. Two, the vision has a spatial quality. And by this we mean that the vision involves not only the earthly realm, the functionings that are happening with the empires that are coming and going, but the heavenly realm as well. In the events of the vision, the rising and the ultimate slaying of the beast, all of these things, they really depict battles as they occur not on earth but in heaven. So in this regard, apocalyptic literature can be said to interpret the events of the earthly realm, the physical world, that is, the rise and the fall of empires, through the lens of similar events occurring in the heavenly realm. Now, within the Bible, the examples of apocalyptic literature are essentially limited to chapters 7 to 12 of the book of Daniel in the Old Testament and the book of Revelation in the New Testament. Now, we should add to this the apocryphal or deuterocanonical work of 4th Ezra, which is also an apocalyptic text. But the apocalyptic literature is hardly limited to these three examples. And it's in the extra-canonical literature where we find many, many more examples. So, for example, the book of 1st Enoch, which we've already mentioned, and which actually happens to be a part of the canonical tradition in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition. This is one example of apocalyptic literature. Likewise, we could point to 3rd Baruch, or the Apocalypse of Abraham, or the Book of Jubilees. All of these are all apocalyptic works. And so what we see is really an explosion of literature of this type, particularly in the late Second Temple period. The question, though, is why? What was it doing? Where did it come from? And why was it so important for this time period? These are really the questions that have occupied scholars who study these types of texts for the better part of a century. So, where does apocalyptic literature come from? And this is really an extremely important question because in some ways it really gets to the core of what apocalyptic literature is after. And essentially there have been three main proposals to this. The first is that apocalyptic literature grew out of the prophetic tradition of the early post-exilic period, most notably kind of growing out of the traditions that we see at work in Zechariah and in some of the Isaianic traditions. So that's one view. Another view is similar, and this is a view popularized by Gerhard von Rott, and that was that apocalypticism is primarily the outgrowth not of the prophetic tradition, but of the wisdom tradition, in that it's an effort to explain not just the things that are seen, as the wisdom tradition tries to do, the things that are observable, but an effort to explain the things that are unseen as well, and in particular the things that are eschatological. So that's a second proposal, somewhat related to the first, in that they both kind of see apocalypticism growing out of types of literature. The third proposal is a proposal that or really a school of thought that says that apocalyptic literature, rather than growing out of a particular literary tradition, grows out of more sociological phenomenon. Basically it's saying that there are things going on in the social settings of the people writing these works that prompt this kind of very sectarian, very symbolic kind of insider focused literature. Now, each of these theories has certain strengths, and each of them really kind of helps to explain particular parts of the apocalyptic tradition. So, for example, there can be little doubt that the apocalyptic visions of Daniel really do address a community that finds itself in a particularly distressing period. But more recent scholarship on the rise of apocalyptic traditions has tended to emphasize that any of these explanations really tries to do too much, that the body of literature that is apocalyptic is really far too broad, and both in terms of content and in terms of its original kind of setting of origin, to fit into any of these neat, convenient explanations. So what we're left doing instead is really kind of looking at apocalyptic works on their own, analyzing each work as its own tradition, and looking instead for the ways in which they interact with each other and with preceding traditions, and also with their environment. So with that in mind, let us turn our attention to the book of Daniel. Now, Daniel is, without a doubt, one of the strangest and most complex books in the Hebrew canon, although we might even say that's a little bit of a misnomer to call it a part of the Hebrew canon, for reasons we'll describe in a second. One of the reasons why this book is so strange and confusing is because there's a really marked shift in the book that takes place at chapter 6. Up until that point, chapters 1 to 6, the book really consists of a series of stories. They're oftentimes called court tales that have at their kind of core this theme of exemplary Jews who are in the exile, who manage to keep their faith and observe their religious traditions in spite of enemies or persecutions. Stylistically, they almost belong like in the tales of Genesis, particularly the Joseph story, with which they have a lot of affinities. And we might confuse them for those were it not for the Babylonian setting of the story. But when one gets to chapter 7 in Daniel, everything changes there. The easy, or rather easy to follow stories are replaced by these exceedingly complex, strange, and symbolic visions. And we should also note that the book of Daniel has, along with Ezra, the curious distinction of being written in two languages. This is the reason why it may be something of a misnomer to call it part of the Hebrew canon. The book begins in Hebrew, certainly enough, but it switches to Aramaic, which is a similar but not mutually intelligible language with Hebrew, in chapter 2, verse 4. Aramaic continues then all the way through the end of chapter 7, and when we get to chapter 8, the book just as suddenly reverts back to Hebrew and continues that way through the end of chapter 12, where the book itself ends, at least in the Hebrew tradition. Now, there has yet to be a really good, satisfactory explanation for exactly why this is the case. So it really will have to do for now simply to note that it happens and to note that the shift does not occur where we would expect it to. And that is that it doesn't occur in the transition from the court tales section to the visions section, but rather occurs after the first vision is completed. So it's not happening in between chapters 6 and 7, it's happening in between chapters 7 and 8. So even the language shift really kind of resists any sort of easy categorization of this book. Now, the second main section of Daniel, the section that runs from chapter 7 to 12. What it really is a series of visions and one kind of textual interpretation or extrapolation in chapter 9. This is the section that's really going to concern us today. And in particular, we're going to kind of focus in on chapter 7 as a kind of prime example of apocalyptic literature. Now, if you'll remember back to our lecture on prophecy, back then I claimed that the goal of prophecy is, or that prophecy in general is really not primarily about the future. It's not about telling the future. Rather, I said it is primarily concerned with telling the mind of God in the present. Now, when we get to apocalyptic literature, we can make a similar but far more qualified claim about apocalyptic literature. It must be qualified because one of the central features of apocalyptic texts is oftentimes a concern for the eschaton, the end times, right? And those are certainly things that have not happened yet, things that are set into the future. So obviously then there is some sort of concern for the future. But if we see it as being all about the future, I think we make a mistake. That is, it's a mistake to see in apocalyptic literature a blueprint for the future. Instead, just as prophecy is intended to communicate God's concern for current events, one of the central claims of apocalyptic literature is that earthly conflicts mirror greater heavenly conflicts. In other words, the struggles of the community of the faithful, their fight in particular against the evils of the world, is the selfsame struggle currently taking place in the heavenly realm. It's a claim about the present, that the present evil that surrounds is not just an earthly evil, it is an evil that is threatening in the heavenly realm as well. As such, even though it may appear that evil is currently winning on earth, there is an assurance that the forces of God, which are also working not only on earth but in heaven, will triumph in the end. Now, we can see then that part of this literature is kind of an implicit hold fast message, a hope that is instilled by the knowledge that God is still at work, even in a world that seems to have gone wrong, and that seems to be dominated by the forces of evil. This idea that that the apocalyptic, like prophecy, is more concerned with the present than the past is really evident in Daniel 7. Although the vision is set in the time of the exile, most scholars agree that its actual composition belongs more somewhere in the 2nd century BCE. Thus, rather than understanding the vision as something that looks forward to a distant future, it is something that speaks immediately to the context of its initial audience. In this case, that is an audience that finds themselves being persecuted by Antiochus IV, the figure who's identified with the little horn in the vision. His reign is really the turning point of that vision, the point at which the Ancient of Days and the one who is like a human being reclaim the world from these evil, blasphemous powers. So we see in that vision it's speaking directly to a time of an initial audience rather than to some far distant future. But it's important to keep in mind something of the the claim here then, right, is that it is important to keep in mind something of the original context when we read books like Daniel, or really any other book of the Bible. But it's also important, just as we recognized with prophecy, to see here that the meaning of texts are not exhausted by, the meaning of text is not exhausted by its original context. That is to say, texts do not only mean something in an original context and then have no claim later on. Rather, texts certainly continue to speak to new times and new environments, and this is true of apocalyptic literature as well. So, for example, within Daniel, we see themes like the idea of the person like a human being, language that is picked up in the New Testament as the Son of Man, and the resurrection imagery that we see particularly in Daniel 12. These themes continue to grow in importance in both Jewish and Christian interpretations that follow. And I certainly don't want to claim that there's anything wrong with that. This is really part of the appropriate use of Scripture. However, as we claimed with prophecy, what I do want to offer is a word of caution about thinking that the text is speaking directly to our own day and to our own events. So what happens if we use Daniel or the book of Revelation or any other apocalyptic text as a cipher for the events of our own day? We fail to see how God has already spoken through the text, right? We miss the intervening period. We think it's just speaking to us, and we miss a huge part of the richness of these texts. Well, furthermore, what we really do is we flatten these enormously complex symbolic systems that are at work in these texts into a direct and often misleading one-to-one correspondence with the events of our own day. And finally, and perhaps most dangerously, we risk our own moral agency by seeing in our own world simply a script that was written centuries ago. Now, these are problems for many reasons, but not the least of which is because they really actually work against the way that apocalyptic texts really function and the way that they're intended. That's because the world of the apocalyptic is not a secret code waiting to be broken. It's not waiting for some sort of cipher to lock it all into place and all of a sudden make it all make perfect sense. Rather, it is a revelation of a world that is demanding to be seen, a revelation of the way in which our world and the heavenly world are inextricably connected. It is an encouragement to continue to struggle against the forces of evil because God and the forces of good continue to do the same. It is not, though, a fatalistic exposition of a divine plan. The apocalyptic world is really strange, and it can be very, very confusing, but it is also remarkably powerful. Texts like Daniel, for all of their esoteric imagery and all of their esoteric logic, continue to speak in enormously profound ways. They invite us to see the world as never before, and they guarantee that we will be forever changed in the process. Well, that's all for these lectures. Remember that we will have one more meeting where we will get together to present to each other our final projects so that we can give each other feedback and encourage each other as we continue to move along in this process. I thank you tremendously for sticking with these lectures, and I hope that they have been informative and have been helpful in some ways. I look forward to our encounters with the final projects, and as always, if you have any questions in the intervening time, please do get in touch with me. Thanks again.